3 minutes ago, Britain didn't just stumble into another shouting match. It walked straight into a political earthquake. Keir Starmer has just thrown down the gauntlet, branding patriotic protesters as dangerous manipulators, while Tommy Robinson and Elon Musk are firing back with words that feel less like debate and more like open warfare. The question everyone is whispering now, is this just another argument, or are we watching the early sparks of something far bigger, something that could reshape Britain forever? Picture this, over 150,000 people, flags raised high, voices echoing through the streets of London. They weren't carrying party banners or union placards. They were waving the Union Jack and the flag of St. George, symbols that should unite, but instead have become the latest battleground. For these men and women, it wasn't about party politics, it was about identity, belonging, and the feeling that their leaders have stopped listening. But just as the chants were fading, Starmer appeared, armed with words sharp enough to slice through the noise. In his speech, the Prime Minister warned that figures like Tommy Robinson and Elon Musk are twisting symbols of pride into weapons of division. He called it shameful, he called it dangerous, and he called it a shadow hanging over Britain. Strong words, but here's the contradiction. Only moments later, Starmer admitted he understood why people were marching. He said he gets the anger, the frustration, the sense of abandonment. So which is it? Does he stand with ordinary Britons, or does he see them as pawns of so-called dangerous populists? You can almost hear the hypocrisy dripping off every line, and this is where things take a darker turn, because Robinson didn't just shrug off the attack. He hit back with venom, vowing that Starmer's government will collapse while he watches and tweets. Elon Musk, never one to stay quiet, amplified the fury by warning that violence is coming whether the Prime Minister likes it or not. Fight back or die, Musk declared, sparking outrage from some, but cheers from many who feel ignored. Ask yourself, when did Britain's debate over flags and patriotism escalate into talk of collapse, violence, and survival? And why does it feel like the government is more interested in demonizing critics than in answering the questions that drove people to the streets in the first place? The most striking part is what reporters on the ground actually saw. No mobs, no burning flags, no hate-filled slogans. Instead, they met families, immigrants proud to be British, and working-class men and women who said they've had enough of being silenced. One man told GB News he's sick of being told to bite his tongue while boats flood Britain's shores. Another immigrant who had integrated into society said he came out to defend the very culture that had given him a home. Does that sound like extremism, or does it sound like ordinary people begging for respect? But Starmer's narrative was clear. These protesters are puppets of populists and billionaires. Convenient, isn't it? If he can paint Robinson as a thug and Musk as an outsider, he doesn't have to admit the uncomfortable truth. That 150,000 voices chanting in unison might not be fringe at all. That they might, in fact, represent a storm gathering against his leadership. And here's the kicker. This isn't just about one march or even one country. Figures from France, Denmark, Germany, Poland and Belgium stood shoulder to shoulder with British protesters, showing this movement has crossed borders. A European wave, all pushing back against immigration, censorship and elites. So now we have a Prime Minister framing patriots as extremists, populists claiming to speak for the people, and a crowd that's only growing larger every weekend. But the real question isn't who shouted loudest on stage. The real question is far more dangerous. If Britain's leaders keep ignoring this anger, what happens when those peaceful flags turn into something else? Cliffhanger line. Because if 150,000 flags can already rattle Downing Street, what happens when the number doubles? Or when the voices shouting back decide they won't settle for speeches anymore? If Section 1 was about the march itself and Starmer's fiery words, Section 2 is about the fallout, the shockwaves that are now spreading through Britain's political landscape. Because what Starmer might have intended as a show of strength has quickly begun to look like weakness. His speech, full of warnings about populists and billionaires, has lit a fire under a movement he wanted to smother. And here lies the irony. The more he calls these protesters dangerous, the more ordinary Britons feel he's talking about them. It's a gamble that could backfire in spectacular fashion. Let's break it down. The mainstream press quickly picked up Starmer's warnings, plastering headlines about populist threats and dark shadows. But the footage from the ground told another story. One of families walking together, men and women carrying flags, and even children riding on their parents' shoulders. The split-screen effect was impossible to ignore. On one side, the establishment screaming extremism, and on the other, citizens demanding to be heard. Which side feels more convincing to the public? That's the question Starmer's advisors are quietly panicking over. And then came the responses. Robinson's words were blunt, even cocky, promising to watch the government collapse. Musk's intervention, though, is what rattled elites the most. Here, you have one of the most powerful businessmen in the world, an outsider, telling Britain that violence is inevitable. Whether you agree with Musk or not, his words travelled faster than any government press release. Millions read them, shared them, and nodded along. For many, it was confirmation that their anger isn't just local. It's global. That someone with Musk's reach sees the same cracks in the system they see every day. But let's not forget the cast of characters who joined the London rally from across Europe. Eric Zemmour, Morten Messerschmidt, Petra Paul, Dominic Tarczynski, Philip de Winter, names that strike fear into the hearts of European progressives but inspire admiration among those tired of migration waves and top-down EU control. Their presence showed that this isn't just a British tantrum, it's a movement feeding into something larger. A continental backlash against elites who say one thing in Parliament and do another behind closed doors. Ask yourself, if Starmer is already shaken by 150,000 Brits, how will he cope when this becomes a European front? The gossip in Westminster corridors is almost comical. Some MPs whisper that Starmer's words were a misstep, others call them necessary. But privately, many fear that he just handed Robinson and Musk exactly what they wanted, legitimacy. By putting their names in the same speech as warnings about threats to democracy, Starmer elevated them from fringe voices to central actors in Britain's political drama. Now, every interview Robinson gives, every tweet Musk sends, will be framed not as noise, but as direct opposition to the Prime Minister himself. And that changes the game entirely. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage spotted an opening. Within hours, he was rolling out his own migration plan, painting himself as the man with solutions, while Starmer was busy picking fights. Farage spoke about welfare cuts, about revoking indefinite leave to remain, and about Britain's economic burden. His message was simple. While Starmer insults the people, I'll save them money. It's the oldest play in politics, but right now it's working, because voters are tired of speeches and hungry for action. Can you blame them? The tension is thick. The Prime Minister tries to cast himself as the voice of calm reason, yet his language grows sharper, more panicked. Protest leaders portray themselves as underdogs, but their reach is spreading by the day. And hovering above it all is the sense that Britain is edging closer to something it hasn't faced in decades, a showdown between its rulers and its ruled. Cliffhanger line. So if this is how Britain reacts after one march and one speech, what happens when the crowds grow louder, the leaders grow bolder, and the streets of London become the stage for a political clash no one can control? By now, the story isn't just about flags and speeches. It's about something far deeper. The widening gap between the rulers and the ruled. The images from London still linger. Seas of red, white and blue clashing with the dark warnings from the Prime Minister's podium. And yet, beneath all the noise, there lies one undeniable truth. Trust is evaporating. When a government tells its people their symbols are tainted, while those same people insist they are marching for unity, the result is not dialogue, but fracture. Britain is facing that fracture right now, and it is spreading through every level of society. You can see it in the media. Outlets like GB News broadcast stories of ordinary people, voices rarely heard in polished debates, while the mainstream presses on with its rise of extremism narrative. Two completely different versions of reality, both competing for legitimacy. And which one do you think resonates with the man sitting at home who can't pay his bills, or the woman waiting months for a hospital appointment? When Starmer says their frustrations are being manipulated, what he really tells them is that they aren't smart enough to see through the populists. That condescension might play well with Westminster elites, but out on the streets it feels like salt in an open wound. Then there's the international angle. European allies of the movement see Britain's protests as part of their own struggle, a mirror reflecting the same anger across Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, and Copenhagen. When Eric Zemmour or Morten Messerschmidt step onto a British stage, they're not just visitors, they're messengers, warning that what's happening in London today could erupt in their own capitals tomorrow. Suddenly, Britain's domestic row over flags looks less like an isolated storm and more like the front line of a European rebellion against what people call globalist politics. That phrase alone is enough to make Brussels shudder, but the gossip doesn't stop there. Inside political circles, the whispers are relentless. Some MPs quietly admit they fear a repeat of the Brexit shock, the establishment underestimating the anger until it explodes at the ballot box. Others whisper even darker thoughts. If people feel ignored for too long, will they stay peaceful? Or will Musk's warning, fight back or die, become a grim prophecy? The government wants to pretend those words are fringe hysteria, but the truth is, once such rhetoric enters the bloodstream of public discourse, it doesn't vanish. It lingers, waiting for the right spark. At the heart of all this lies the issue of respect. Respect for the flag, respect for free speech, respect for the ordinary Briton who feels abandoned. Starmer can dismiss Robinson and mock Musk, but he cannot erase the sight of 150,000 people on the streets. He cannot stop families from demanding answers. And he cannot hide the contradictions in his own words, conceding people have real grievances, then dismissing their leaders as thugs and opportunists. That mixed message isn't calming Britain, it's igniting it. And let's not forget Farage, ever the opportunist, seizing his moment to propose bold changes while others argue about tone. Abolishing indefinite leave to remain, slashing welfare spending, and reframing migration as an economic betrayal. Farage knows exactly what strings to pull, and the more the Prime Minister rails against flags and speeches, the more Farage looks like the only one offering concrete answers, however controversial. For voters, the choice becomes simple: insults from the top or promises from the outsider. This is the crossroad Britain now stands at. Leaders calling for calm but fueling division, protesters demanding respect but branded as extremists, outsiders shaping the debate more than the elected government. And through it all, the tension only grows. No one can say exactly how this ends, but one thing is certain: the stage is being set for a confrontation Britain hasn't seen in a generation. Cliffhanger line. So if Britain is already this divided after one march, one speech, and one warning, what happens when the next rally makes today look small, and the voices in the crowd stop asking politely and start demanding power? The storm that began with one march and one speech is now swelling into something much larger, and this final chapter is about the consequences that no one in power dares to admit. Britain is no stranger to protest, but this time feels different. It is not just a disagreement about policy or a cry for minor reforms. It is a clash of visions. One side holding up the Union Jack as a symbol of pride, unity, and survival. The other side insisting that the very same flag has been hijacked by populists and opportunists. When symbols become battlegrounds, history tells us that nations do not simply return to calm waters. They either resolve the conflict or they fracture under its weight. Which path will Britain choose? Starmer's strategy is clear. Delegitimize the leaders, paint them as dangerous, and hope the movement fades under the weight of negative headlines. But look closer, and you see the opposite happening. Every insult fuels resentment. Every dismissal strengthens the sense of betrayal. People who once felt invisible now feel targeted, and strangely, that makes them more powerful. The crowd sees itself not just as protesters, but as defenders of a country slipping through their fingers. And once ordinary citizens start believing they are guardians of a nation under threat, they don't go home quietly, they dig in. Meanwhile, Robinson thrives on the controversy. He knows that every mention of his name from the Prime Minister is free publicity. Musk, too, doesn't have to lift a finger. His single video message ricocheted through Britain like a shockwave, making him part of the story whether Starmer likes it or not. Together, these figures become larger than life, symbols of defiance in a time when establishment voices sound increasingly hollow. Ask yourself, when did the battle over Britain's identity turn into a showdown between politicians and billionaires, between Westminster and Twitter feeds? And more importantly, who's really winning that fight? Then there's the European factor, and it cannot be ignored. The presence of foreign political figures at the London rally signaled something more dangerous than domestic unrest. It signaled a network, a web of movements, parties, and personalities all feeding off one another's momentum. A French populist sees hope in Britain's protests, a German MP sees validation, a Polish voice sees an ally. If Starmer hoped to contain the anger within Britain's borders, he has already failed. The flames are spreading across the continent, and with every new speech, every new rally, the sense of a shared rebellion grows stronger. What about Farage? His migration plan was not just policy, it was a provocation. By announcing cuts to welfare and promising to abolish indefinite leave to remain, he positioned himself as the man who dares to do what others only talk about. The Prime Minister can call protesters extremists, but Farage is offering numbers, costs, and solutions. For the struggling Briton, who sounds more in touch, the politician who dismisses anger as manipulation, or the one who promises to save billions and restore control? That is why Farage's words sting Starmer more than Robinson's slogans or Musk's warnings. They hit the voters directly in their wallets, where the pain is real. So here Britain stands, divided, angry, and restless. A government clinging to authority by casting shadows over its critics. Protesters who believe they are fighting for survival, not just slogans. Foreign allies feeding the fire. An opportunist like Farage sharpening their knives for the moment when trust in the establishment collapses completely. The gossip may call it chaos, the press may call it extremism, but to many, it feels like the only path left when leaders stop listening. The truth is simple and terrifying. This is not going away. Each weekend will bring more flags, more voices, more anger. The choice before the Prime Minister is stark. Engage with the people or continue dismissing them. Because if he keeps choosing the latter, Britain may find itself stumbling into a crisis not just of politics, but of identity, unity, and democracy itself. Cliffhanger line. So if the cracks are already this wide, how long before Britain stops arguing about division and starts living through the collapse of its own union? If the previous chapters revealed the protest, the rhetoric, and the fallout, this section digs into the deeper undercurrents, the forces pulling Britain toward a confrontation its leaders refuse to acknowledge. Because beneath every headline about marches and speeches lies a fundamental question: what does it actually mean to belong to Britain today? The government speaks in polished phrases about inclusion and democracy, but the people on the streets are asking something raw. Who decides what British identity is, and why do those in power always seem ashamed of it? That is why the flag has become such a lightning rod. To millions of ordinary citizens, it is not about politics, it is about recognition. Recognition that their work, their sacrifices, their culture still matter in a country that feels unrecognizable. Yet when the Prime Minister suggests their pride has been hijacked by extremists, it feels less like a warning and more like an insult. It tells them that their identity itself is suspect, that their loyalty is conditional. And once trust in something as basic as the flag collapses, what else is left for people to rally around? The gossip spilling out of Westminster is that Starmer is doubling down. Advisors are urging him to keep hammering the populist threat line, betting that fear of Robinson and Musk will outweigh sympathy for the marchers. But here's the twist. The more he attacks, the more Robinson appears to be a martyr. Musk appears to be a truth teller, and the people waving flags appear to be victims of elite scorn. It is a cycle that feeds itself, and it's one the government cannot easily control. Meanwhile, the streets are shifting. Reports show not only repeat protesters, but new faces appearing each weekend. Entire families are joining, not because they idolize Robinson or Musk, but because they recognize themselves in the frustration. Teachers, factory workers, small business owners, even immigrants who once believed the system welcomed them. These are not the caricatures of angry mobs painted by the establishment. These are the faces of a middle Britain slowly deciding that silence is no longer an option. Across the continent, the momentum builds. In France, similar rallies flare up. In Germany, discontent simmers. In Poland, populists openly cheer Britain's unrest as proof that the tide is turning. A cross-border network is taking shape, not through official treaties or party platforms, but through shared anger and shared defiance. And Britain, whether it likes it or not, has become the flagship of this new wave. That is why the London March mattered more than numbers. It wasn't just 150,000 people, it was the spark seen around Europe. And then there is the silent majority, the people not yet marching but watching closely. Pollsters whisper that support for protest sentiments is far higher than politicians admit. Behind closed doors, officials concede that anger over migration, censorship, and cultural identity runs deep in communities far from London. If even a fraction of these silent voices decide to join the marches, the numbers will swell beyond anything Britain has seen in modern times. At that point, speeches and dismissals won't be enough. At that point, the government will be staring down a movement too large to contain. What does Starmer do then? If he cracks down harder, he risks fueling the very anger he fears. If he softens, he looks weak and indecisive. It is a trap of his own making, one that grows tighter with each passing week. And through it all, opposition voices like Farage circle like vultures, waiting for the moment when the government's missteps push voters directly into their arms. Cliffhanger line. So if Britain's leaders are already trapped between fueling anger and appearing weak, what happens when the silent majority decides it's time to stop watching and start marching?